Welcome to the West Cork History Festival podcast. My name's Simon Kingston. I'm one of the co-founders of the festival, and you can find out more about the festival and other recordings of the talks and debates that we've held at the festival each year on our website at www.westcorkhistoryfestival.org. The talk you're about to listen to now was recorded at our festival in August 2024, and it was given by Henry Hemming, who was talking about his most recent book, 4 Shots in the Night, a true story of espionage, murder, and justice in Northern Ireland. And it touches on the extraordinary and ongoing discovery of the real facts behind the agent known as Stakeknife in Northern Ireland. It was a fascinating discussion to hear, and we hope you'll enjoy it now. Yesterday, those of you who were here for Martin Doyle's discussion of the writing of his memoir of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, Dirty Linen, we began to touch on some of the aspects of the intelligence and security campaign in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And indeed, towards the end of that, and because it's very much a live news story at the moment, we talked specifically about Stakeknife and about that aspect of the campaign in Northern Ireland. So we're very fortunate indeed to have today Henry Hemming to talk to us about his book, 4 Shots in the Night, which is something still of a moving picture, as no doubt he will talk about. There have been disclosures on this matter in the last couple of days, indeed, that will continue to shape an evolving picture. But Henry is extraordinarily well placed to describe this. He's not only a journalist of distinction, but has written a series of treatments of complex espionage, security and intelligence-related stories of the 20th and 21st century. So I think he's extremely well placed to talk to us about this. And the book, I can tell you, is a fascinating read and available from Cathal O'Donovan and his stuff at the end. But without anything further from me, over to you, Henry, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Simon, and it's really lovely to be here. I was talking to my 7-year-old son yesterday, and I was telling him that I was coming here to talk about my book, and I remember he asked me if I was nervous, and I said, well, yes and no, nervous and excited, and he then asked me what the book was about, which was troubling, given that I've been telling him about it for the last 5 years. But it struck me that's the obvious place to start. What is this book about that you can see on the screen here? 4 Shots in the Night is, at its heart, the story of a single murder. It's about the build-up to this killing. It's about the event itself, but it's also about the fallout in the years that followed. But I suppose in a broader sense, it's about the way in which this particular killing began to change the way we understand the conflict that took over in the north of Ireland that we all refer to as the Troubles. I guess the standard thing for me to do in a talk like this is try and give you just a kind of overview of the book, start at the front, begin at the end at the end. And I want to do something slightly different. I thought I'd just focus instead on this one murder and the question in particular of who was responsible. Who was behind this killing? Because nobody has ever been prosecuted for the murder I'm about to tell you about, and I hope that in the next half hour we can get a little bit closer to understanding what may have happened. And I want to add at this point, not so much a spoiler alert, but a kind of a trigger warning, that I will be talking about a murder, and there will be at least one picture which is disturbing. And we're all friends here. I won't be offended if anyone walks out now, because some of the things in this talk may be upsetting. It's worth saying that some of you may have a particularly close connection to the story that I'm going to be talking about that I don't know about. And it may be that you have family in the north. Maybe you were part of a protest or a petition long ago. Maybe you served in some capacity in Northern Ireland. Maybe you're part of the intelligence services. I mean, quick show of hands, anyone from MI5? Go on. I was really hoping that was going to work at last. But whatever your background, whatever you bring to this story, I hope that something in what I say in the next half hour or so will either challenge or maybe change your perception of the Troubles, and in particular, the role that was played by undercover agents. That really is the focus of what I'll be talking about. So, without further ado, let's begin. So I want to start by asking you to imagine a sweep of moorland, very different to the kind of landscape we have here. A sweep of moorland, barely a tree in sight, and there's a road running through the middle of it. It's unpaved. And there's a farmer walking down this road. This all happened, by the way. I'm not just inventing this. And he was off on this particular morning to go and check on his cows. He was walking down the road, and then he saw ahead of him a body. He saw basically this. And rather than get any further, rather than get closer to this body, he stopped in his tracks, he called out, and when he heard no response, he turned around and he went back to his farmhouse. And of course, on the face of it, that sounds callous, that sounds strange. Why would he turn around straight away? But it only makes sense in the historical context. I haven't told you when this particular scene unfolded. This is May 1986. So over in London, Maggie Thatcher is in Downing Street. The film you're most likely to see in the cinemas in Northern Ireland is Top Gun. The song you're going to hear on the radio is Rock Me Amadeus. And we are 17 years into the conflict known as the Troubles. And a lot of the time when I'm talking about this book, I'm talking to a British audience that knows astonishingly little about the Troubles. So you'll forgive me if I'm going to talk a little bit about the three main ingredients. Forgive me if this is teaching grandmothers to suck eggs. There are three parts to this conflict, and I think sometimes one or two of them get lost in the description. The first part of it was the Civil Rights Campaign, which began in the late 1960s. And this is inspired by the Civil Rights Campaign in the US. And it was geared towards one particular thing, and that was to end discrimination against Catholics in Northern Ireland. That's what people were marching about. And this then, the reaction to this Civil Rights Campaign, introduced the second element of this growing, burgeoning conflict. And that was when the mostly Protestant police, the RUC, began to crack down on the mostly Catholic protesters, and did so in an unfair way, an unjust way. And this led to scenes that were then displayed around the world. It led to a growing awareness of the situation, but it created a more sectarian conflict. And all over Northern Ireland, which up until then had been one of the most peaceful places on earth, staggering to think what the statistics were for violent crime in Northern Ireland up until about 1968. All over Northern Ireland, during that summer of 1969, people from different backgrounds began to bring down from the attics of their minds some of their darkest fantasies, really, of sameness and ethnic purity. And Protestant families living in Catholic areas and Catholic families living in Protestant areas began to be forced to leave where they had lived all their lives. Homes were burned, people began to be killed. And it was after this that the government in Northern Ireland asked the government in London for the help of the British Army, and the British Army was sent over. And only then do you have the third element of this conflict, which is an insurgency, which begins after the creation of the Provisional IRA, about 4 months after the army first arrives. And their aim is different to what the civil rights campaigners wanted. They want unification of Ireland, and by any means necessary. These are the three different ingredients. Any one of these could be enough to create a conflict that could run and run. But if you mix the three together, as happened in Northern Ireland, you had a situation that seemed insoluble. It seemed like something that could continue indefinitely and continue through the generations. So by 1986, this is roughly the situation. And this is the context for, I've got a picture of Derry in 1972. That's the official IRA. This is the context for what the farmer saw. Can anyone think why the farmer did not get any closer to the body and instead went back to his farmhouse? What was that? Booby trapped, exactly right. So the provisional IRA, by this point in the Troubles, had a reputation and a history for placing booby traps underneath the bodies of some of their victims, the intention being to kill the first responders, usually the police. And the farmer, as a result, went home. He called up the police because he was on the north. It was the RUC who came along. And pretty soon after that, 2 policemen arrived at the scene. So you can imagine the 2 of them faced with this scene. Now, is anyone here someone who used to be in the police? No? Or if they are, they're keeping it to themselves. Can anyone guess what the first thing you're meant to do as a police officer arriving at the scene of what appears to have been a crime?
Control the area?
Yeah, that's actually number 2. You're absolutely right. Number 1 is preserve life. So they did the same thing. They called out to the body. And then, because they were worried about the booby trap, they did not get any closer. They called in the army bomb disposal unit, who said, we'll be there in a couple of hours. Then they moved on to the second thing, which is preserve the scene. So they set up cordons. You can begin to see a cordon up there. There's another one just out of shot on the other side. And then they began to scour the area close to the body, trying to find some kind of evidence, some kind of clue, something that would give it a sense of what had happened, probably in the night before this body was found. And there are 5 things they noted down. The first is that the body had not been there long. So they're almost certain this murder had took place in the last 24 hours or so. And the second is they could see what appeared to be a gunshot wound in this man's head. But just one is all they could see. They also noticed that he was wearing unusually smart clothes, as in it didn't look like he'd just been taken out of his car or just seized from his house. It appeared that he knew he was going to a meeting and that he dressed up for the occasion. And the fourth thing they noticed, which confused them at first, was that around this man's hands, there was rope around each of the wrists. You could see that the rope had been tied together at one point, but after that it had been cut. So at one point this man had had his hands tied together, but then that rope was severed. And the final thing they saw, and this is one which confused them and many others for years to come, was that there was masking tape over each of the eyes. Not a blindfold, but masking tape. Very, very carefully sealed over the sockets of each of this man's eyes. So those are the 5 things that they noticed. These are the 5 clues they had to try and interpret. But I suppose the best clue came later that day. The bomb disposal units came, they established there was no booby trap there, and then the body was taken away. It was, by the way, raining very lightly when this all happened. I should have mentioned that. Lighter than this. And once the body had been taken away, can you all hear me, by the way? Good. They were then able to find in the ground underneath where the body had been a single bullet. So they found 1 bullet. And there was a lot they could read into this. The fact that this bullet had gone right through the man's head into the body below. It suggested an execution. It did not suggest an argument that had got out of hand or an accident or something like that. The people who were doing this almost certainly knew exactly what they were doing. And later that night, they had their best clue yet, when the IRA brigade in Derry/Londonderry released a statement. And they took full responsibility for this murder, and they claimed that the victim, a man called Frank Hegarty, had been a British spy. This was news in Northern Ireland and across the UK and also here in the Republic. And immediately for the police, this narrows down their pool of suspects. So they're almost certain it's going to be someone connected to the IRA or a pair of people who have some kind of IRA history. But what's interesting is what happened next. So usually in the aftermath of an IRA killing like this, the family of the victim would go to the newspapers, would go to the radio, would say, there's not a shred of truth to this. Our relative was not a spy. They had no connection to the British at all. And what happened in this case is that the family of Frank Hegarty instead told everyone who would listen, told their neighbors, told journalists, that there was one person who was responsible for this killing. And they took the unusual step of naming him. They said the man responsible was this man here, Martin McGuinness. And this photo was taken around about the time of Frank Hegarty's murder. And this is about 4 years into Martin McGuinness's reinvention as a Sinn Féin politician. And I'm sure a lot of you know the basic outline of McGuinness's life. He, unlike Gerry Adams, had by this point, he was talking about his IRA past, but he was absolutely set on presenting himself as a man of peace, a man who was out there to defend the likes of the Hegartys, and not someone who would ever get involved in something like an IRA murder or someone accused of being a British spy. But McGuinness was not charged in the days that followed, nor was he interrogated or questioned by the local police, which is interesting, and the family couldn't quite work it out. 7 years later, in 1993, fresh evidence emerged, and there was a new investigation into Frank Hegarty's murder. And this time, the local police were convinced they had enough evidence to charge Martin McGuinness with his involvement in the murder of Frank Hegarty, and they're convinced they had enough to bring about a successful prosecution and to put him behind bars for a considerable length of time. But then the prosecution was dropped, suddenly. And not everyone on the police, and certainly not the family, understood exactly why. The following year, the IRA declared a ceasefire, and then 4 years after that, we had the Good Friday Agreement. And so, as the world acknowledged and in many cases celebrated, the Troubles appeared to have come to an end. And there's a very different mood in Northern Ireland. There are a lot of people who wanted purely to look to the future. And I find this sort of part of what was going on very interesting. You have some people who didn't feel that, but most people felt now is not the time to interrogate the past. And if you look around the world, if you look at similar instances of civil war or conflict equivalent to the Troubles, you find an almost identical thing. That when there is no clear moral victor, usually there's a tacit agreement that we need to look to the future for now. We leave the interrogation of the past until later. And often it's 20, 25 years after that peace that people start to look back, start to really try and disentangle the different threads of what happened and to find out who was responsible and why. But even then, there were people straight after the Good Friday Agreement who could not move on, who could not just put it in the past. And of course, the people who felt that the strongest were the families of the victims. It's amazing to think of these numbers, but by this point, when this photograph was taken, there were still more than 1,000 unsolved murders from the Troubles. So you try and multiply that, 1,000 families and friends of families, still unclear about exactly what had happened to a loved one. And one of those was the family of Frank Hegarty. They still wanted answers, and they wanted justice. And the year after the Good Friday Agreement, they began to have some of that. I'm just going to touch on that mood post-Good Friday Agreement. I should have added one of the people who was definitely keen to focus only on the future was your man Martin McGuinness, as well as Ian Paisley. And they're photographed here at a time when they were known as the Chuckle Brothers. And this is when Martin McGuinness was the Deputy First Minister. And he had around this time, similar to when he had a run for the Irish presidency, would initially, when asked about the Troubles or his IRA past, would dismiss the question as if it were in bad taste, as if it was sort of beneath him to talk about that. But as I say, even immediately after the Good Friday Agreement, there are a lot of people who still wanted answers, who still wanted justice. And in 1999, the family of Frank Hegarty had what appeared to be an extraordinary breakthrough. There was an article which was published in the Sunday Times, and an anonymous source had gone to one of the lead reporters there, a man called Liam Clark, and had told Liam Clark about the existence of an undercover agent deep inside the IRA. And according to this anonymous source, the agent was codenamed Stakeknife. Now, at the time, nobody outside a very small number of security force officials had ever heard of Stakeknife. And it sounded bizarre. I mean, that name, Stakeknife, just sounded made up or just slightly nuts. Anyway, this article described him as being a very senior IRA figure, described him as the crown jewel of the British intelligence operation, and suggested that he was being paid something like £80,000 every year. And of course, there was intense speculation as to who Stakeknife could have been. Some people began to wonder whether Martin McGuinness might conceivably have been an agent of some kind. Is that maybe why he kept out of jail for so long? Is that maybe why these investigations into him were dropped? But the Stakeknife story mainly focused on the Frank Hegarty murder. So the person who produced this information wanted to point out that Stakeknife had been responsible for Frank Hegarty's murder. That's what had motivated this particular individual to come forward and to talk to the Sunday Times. And so I guess I want us to talk about the two figures that I've discussed so far, the Stakeknife, but also Frank Hegarty. I don't think I've said enough about who he was and what he could have done. So who was he, and was he actually a spy? This is Frank Hegarty 2 years before he was killed. He was a man who spent most of his life in Derry. He was famous, or just well known throughout his neighborhood, for his love of greyhounds. He was brilliant at training greyhounds, at breeding greyhounds. He could look after your greyhound if your greyhound had been injured. He was very good at sewing up minor lacerations and injuries. And he was also a family man. He was a father of 3 by the time he was killed. And his second child, Ryan, was age 5 when his father was killed. And to this day, he still remembers seeing the news report when he first found out that his father had been murdered. And I've got to say, when I was researching and writing this book, this is one of many moments that really brought home the scale of this story and just the emotional trauma that must have been and was inflicted on many of the people involved. My son was aged about 5 at that time, and I was trying to imagine what it would be like for him to know that I had died, but then also to understand what it was like for Ryan in the years that followed. So it's enough to have your father be killed, but it's what happens afterwards in terms of the bullying, in terms of the taunts, in terms of this allegation that your dad might have been a tout, and maybe so are you. And that was something that Ryan found incredibly difficult to live with. And that was the question he was asking himself throughout his childhood. Was my dad actually a spy? What did he do? And that, I think, is the question I want to answer next. Was Frank Hegarty a spy? I think before I directly answer that, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of the British intelligence operation in Northern Ireland by 1986. And I've written a lot about intelligence in the past, but a lot of what I found out about this particular story about the British operation in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, I found fascinating and new. And so much of this information has only come to light in the last 10, 15 years, and more continues to come forward. Even as we heard in the news a couple of days ago, there is more information that's just come to light. So it's a constantly evolving story. But here's something we do know. By 1986, there were 3 agencies, running agents, inside Northern Ireland. You had the police, you had the British Army, and you had MI5. And there's a lot of speculation over the years about just how many agents were they running. Are we talking about, I don't know, 3 or 4? Are we talking about sort of 20, 30? And I was blown away by a comment made by this man, Father Dennis Bradley, and so many other people. He belonged at one point to the consultative group on the past. And in this capacity, he was shown government documents which described how many agents were being run by the British in the early 1990s. And he went on the record. He was interviewed by the BBC, and he said it was 800 agents. And what's even more remarkable is that in that same BBC documentary, they interviewed an intelligence professional who heard that number 800 and scoffed. And he said, no, it was far more than that. And, I mean, over in the UK, we talk a lot about the Cambridge 5. How about the Northern Ireland 800? It's a stunning figure. I should add immediately, as a kind of caveat, these are not 800 top-level spies. At the very lower end of the spectrum, you could have someone who, let's say, lives in a farm near the border, who agrees to give information once every couple of weeks, maybe once a month, to a policeman who comes by. And I should add also that some of the time is voluntary, some of the times it's willing, but there are other times when it's coerced. In other words, a policeman or someone from MI5 or the army has something compromising and uses that to persuade or coerce the person they're talking to supply information. Still, it's a big operation. Was Frank Hegarty one of these agents? Yes, he was. And he was working for the army. He was working for something called the FRU. I guess the first question that comes to mind when you think of an intelligence operation this size is, what were they trying to do? What was the aim, what was the objective that they all had in common? And then the second question is, did it work? Were they successful? Was this a useful thing to have done? Maybe I should try and answer those two questions. So, what were they trying to do? Broadly speaking, there were two things that most agents working in Northern Ireland were trying to contribute to. One was providing tactical intelligence. In other words, information that could possibly save lives. So it might be the location of a possible bomb that's going to be planted 2 days from now. It could be news of a hijacking that's going to happen, or a rumor, that kind of thing. But the second thing, and this has only come to light more recently, is the strategic intelligence. And this is when you had agents inside Sinn Féin, or close to Sinn Féin, who were trying to turn the party into a more credible political alternative to the IRA. You had people like Willie Carlin, you had people like Dennis Donaldson, who were inside Sinn Féin, and rather than being told to slow things up, as some right-wing politicians in London would say they should, or would wish would happen, these agents were doing the opposite. They're actually trying to speed up Sinn Féin's accession to power, trying to increase their vote share at each forthcoming election. And the next question is, did it work? Was any of this successful? And maybe I'll just tell you one story to illustrate one part of the answer to that. And it begins with this photo here, which I hope you can all see. Can anyone tell me, I think the person on the left is pretty easy to spot, but can someone tell me who the three men on the right are? Yes, very quick. Duran Duran, Princess Diana's favorite band at that time. This is 1983, and this photo was taken in July. It was a very hot day. It was in London, the Dominion Theatre. Just out of shot is her husband, the current king. And this is just before a concert for the Prince's Trust. And Duran Duran are about to go on stage. And just after this photograph was taken, the royal couple are led up the stairs. You can see you can see the balcony in the background. They went along the balcony, and then they were shown into the royal box. And everyone knew that's where they were going to sit. They sat down in the royal box. Duran Duran began to play. They played really well. It was a great set, and everyone went home that night thinking, what a successful night. A lot of money was raised, everyone was happy. But there were a handful of people who went to bed that night, aware that a change in the line of royal succession had narrowly been avoided, and that carnage had also been averted. There was an IRA plan to kill the royal couple during the middle of the Duran Duran set. One IRA active service unit had put together a plan to plant a bomb in the lavatory just behind the royal box, and they were going to tile it up in the cistern. So it'd be impossible to see if you're doing a check. And it was, as I say, designed to go off in the middle of the Duran Duran concert. We know that this technology worked because the exact same thing was used the following year, 1984, in Brighton, in the attempt to kill Thatcher, which very, very nearly succeeded. This one didn't, for the simple reason that the person who was given the job of planting the bomb was a spy. And they're reporting to the Garda and would soon be reporting to MI5 very soon after that. And that's one example of an espionage success. And I guess what's interesting about it is that, like so many intelligence successes, it's negative. It's about something which did not happen, as opposed to something which obviously did, which you can measure. And already this is something which comes up a lot when people are picking over the story of whether this intelligence operation in Northern Ireland was successful. It's sometimes very difficult to know how many lives are being saved when intelligence leads to a bomb not going off. Because you can never tell. You never know how many people could have been killed in that particular bomb or that particular explosion. So, as I said, Frank Hegarty was a part of this enormous operation in Northern Ireland by 1986. He was being run by a specialist secretive unit inside the army called the Force Research Unit, or the FRU. And I'm going to save for the book the story of exactly how he was recruited. And these, by the way, are some of the people who got to know him and run him during his time as an agent. He began as an eyes and ears agent, so he was passing on low-level information that he heard just from friends or just down at the pub. But then about 4 years into his espionage career, it changed. And he was asked to get inside the IRA. And he then found out something which he then revealed to his handlers, which turned him into a target for the IRA, which, in a very convoluted way, played a part in his death, in his murder. But I want to focus now on the person who's believed to have killed him, Stakeknife, someone who we've heard about a lot in the last year in particular. And a lot of this began, I was actually in Belfast earlier this year for the release of an interim report into something called Operation Canova. Has anyone heard of Operation Canova? Some people, okay. So Operation Canova began in 2016, and it's one of the largest murder investigations in British history. And it was an investigation into one thing. It was the activities of Stakeknife. It had 72 detectives. It cost more than £40 million. It had access to tens of thousands of classified government documents, although some are still coming to light now, as we heard in the news a couple of days ago. And at the end of this investigation, this interim report was released. And the man leading this report was John Boucher, who is now head of the PSNI in Northern Ireland. And it's a job he got largely as a result of how he handled Operation Canova. And I think unlike almost every other investigation on the British side into intelligence activities in the North or during the Troubles, this is one that was more victim-centered than any other. And I think for a lot of people, John Boucher earned a lot of respect from the way he handled this situation and the way he took on MI5 and the way he really appeared to have gone after them to get as much information out of them as possible. Now, there are a lot of things that came up in the report, but one of the things that Boucher really struggled with was not being able to name in the report who Stakeknife was, but he as good as went and did it. it became very clear during the press conference in which he released this report that Stakeknife was not Martin McGuinness. He was Freddie Scappaticci, who was a Belfast bricklayer who was recruited back in 1977 by a young army sergeant. At the time that he was recruited, Scappaticci did not belong to the IRA. He'd been kicked out. And the fact that he'd been kicked out gives you the first way into his psychology, but also the first way into why he wanted to get back at the IRA. Scappaticci was an incredibly proud man. And I suppose in the kind of the landscape of his pathology, to understand what motivated him, he wanted revenge. And as soon as the man who recruited him understood this, he began to see that he could be persuaded to go back into the IRA and to provide as much information as he could possibly find. And this is what happened. And within about 3 or 4 years of going back into the IRA, Scappaticci was producing more and better intelligence than any other source that the British had. It was described as a one-man Bletchley Park. There was a staggering volume and quality of information. Some of it was about a bomb that was going to go off or an attack that was going to happen. But some of it also was high-level strategic stuff. So his car was wired for sound, and often he would drive around Jerry Adams late at night, and they'd both talk about life, politics, and the future. And some of these tapes were later played to visiting British politicians who at the time still had no idea where they had come from, but couldn't believe the quality of this intelligence. But, you may have guessed there's a but coming, there was a terrible price to pay. The reason Scappaticci was so trusted, the reason he was able to get such good intelligence, was that he'd become a part of something called the IRA's Nutting Squad. And the Nutting Squad was responsible for vetting new recruits. It would also interrogate people within the IRA who were suspected of being informers. And if the interrogation led to a confession, that would be sent to the IRA top brass, the likes of McGuinness and Adams, and the decision would come back as to whether or not this person should be murdered. And as I understand it, and from everything I've read, more times than not, the answer was that they should. And often the Nutting Squad was given the job of killing the person who had just been interrogated. Freddie Scappaticci became the deputy commander of the IRA's Nutting Squad. At any one time, there are about 12 people in this unit. So he was a senior figure in this particular bit of the IRA. And because he, as the IRA would call it, he was dirty, he had been involved in a murder, he was entirely trusted. And that's a large part of the reason why he was able to provide so much intelligence. And he was being run by the same people that were running Frank Hegarty. So he was being run by the army, not by MI5 and not by the police. The army were very protective. They didn't want anyone else to have access to their star agent. And what's interesting is the moral element of this. I suppose like most writers, whenever I take on a subject or a story or a new book, I only really want to write it if I feel there is some kind of moral difficulty or complexity. And for me with this story, that moral complexity was right here when it came to the decisions that were made by the handlers looking after people like Frank Hegarty and Scappaticci. And it's something that you have throughout the history of espionage. I call it the spy master's dilemma. And the spy master's dilemma is this, it's very simple. Will I save more lives if I act on this piece of intelligence? Or will I save more lives if I do not? I mean, on the face of it, that sounds mad. I mean, how? Imagine yourselves to be one of those handlers. You're in Northern Ireland, and your agent has come to you to say, I believe there's going to be an attack that's going to happen tonight, and I believe that people could be killed. Surely the only thing you do, the only sane, logical thing to do, is to inform your colleagues in the police and to make sure the attack does not take place. And yet, if the only reason that you could possibly have known about that is because this one person has told you, your agent, then effectively you're putting your agent's life in huge danger. You're, in some ways, you could say, signing their death warrant. by having the police act on this intelligence. The next complication is that you don't know if the agent's correct. You don't know if there is actually going to be an attack in that place. The next complication is that the agent might be vague. He might say, we think it's going to happen either tonight or actually tomorrow morning or possibly the day after. But the main difficulty is you don't know how many lives your agent is going to save in the future. You don't know if by keeping your agent in play, you'll be able to save 10, 100 lives over the next 10 years. And if instead you say, okay, this is so big, we have to get our agent out, and we have to act on this intelligence, whether in fact there's going to be a net loss of lives. And what makes it even harder is that the handlers being faced with these decisions, or the people above them, did not have the training. They weren't prepared for situations like this. They didn't know what the law was. They didn't understand what was the best solution to some of these problems. And a lot of the time, there was no right answer. There was just a series of wrong ones. Sometimes the weight of these moral dilemmas became too much. There's at least one instance of a British handler killing himself after 2 of his agents were killed by the IRA. And there's also an instance of one person, when he found out that Scappaticci was a British agent and realized that Scappaticci could have killed his friend, Frank Hegarty, this one person went to the papers and broke the story. And I've circled him here. This is Ian Hurst, who now lives in the Republic and is quite vocal about Stakeknife and what has happened in the past. He's the person that broke the story, and without what he said, without his decision to come forward in 1999, just after the Good Friday Agreement, I certainly wouldn't be standing here talking about this. I don't believe that Operation Canova would have taken place, and we know a lot less about the intelligence operation in Northern Ireland. So Ian Hurst was the person who first broke the dam. Operation Canova was enormous and put together a vast body of evidence, all designed to get Freddie Scappaticci behind bars. But the people running it knew they weren't going to get him, or they were not knew, they suspected they weren't really going to get him unless they could persuade Scappaticci himself, who was still alive during the first stages of Canova, unless they could persuade him to make a confession. So in 2018, they arrested him. He was living in a safe house in Guildford, or just on the suburbs of Guildford, in a very sort of normal suburban street. Apparently the only difference with his house was that his privet hedge was a bit higher. He was interrogated by the Canova detectives. And this is a moment that John Boucher and others have been building up to for years. He was asked many, many questions that day, but he said not a word. He stonewalled. The amazing thing is that the closest Freddie Scappaticci would ever come during his life to a public confession was back in 1993, and what's also amazing is that it was triggered by something to do with Frank Hegarty's death. So I'm going to jump back in time one last time, and this is where I'm going to end this talk. We went from the beginning of the Troubles, we went from 1986, we were in the Good Friday Agreement, we were earlier this year, but now we're going to go to the summer of '93. John Major is Prime Minister. Take that and number 1 with Pray. All I do each night is pray, that one. And the most popular programme in the UK, I don't know if it was in the Republic much, probably not, was something called The Cook Report. Does anyone remember that? Roger Cook was the guy fronting it, and what he would usually do is confront a criminal or a con man, and there'd be some kind of altercation. It was really good TV, I remember loving it. But in 1993, they decided to do a different kind of program, and they investigated the murder of Frank Hegarty, and they decided to try and work out who was responsible. So they began to interview people, or look for interviewees, who knew Frank, who knew something about this story, who'd been in the IRA themselves. And nobody was prepared to speak on camera, apart from one person. And that was Rose Hegarty, Frank's mother. And I mean, the context of this is really interesting. It took enormous courage to speak out in the way that she did. Martin McGuinness at that time was still feared in Derry, where Rose lived, and all the other people who agreed to take part in this program did so in silhouette and with their voice completely disguised, or their words being spoken by an actor. Rose said no. She wanted to be shown full face in front of the cameras, and she was interviewed in her local church. And this gave the testimony even more power. Martin McGuinness had always described himself as someone who defended people like Rose Hegarty, but here she was on tape saying Martin McGuinness was responsible for the murder of her son. She then described him as an evil man. And then she corrected herself and said, evil is too good a word for him. This interview, in which she said that McGuinness was responsible, but wouldn't go into any details, had huge repercussions. It led to questions in Parliament. It led to a new investigation by the RUC into McGuinness. And this is the one I referred to earlier. And that, in fact, would be dropped because MI5 intervened, which I'll leave for the book exactly why that was and MI5's relationship with McGuinness. But that's why that police investigation came to nothing. But it also led to a phone call to the Cook Report producers the following day, the day after this program went out. And it was from someone in Belfast who called himself Jack. And he called up and he said, what you put out there in the program was interesting, but there's more to it than that. And he wanted to meet the Cook Report producers and tell them the full story. So the producers agreed, and they met in a car park outside the Culloden Hotel, just on the outskirts of Belfast. And unknown to this man who called himself Jack, there was a recording device inside the car where they had the conversation. So the man who called himself Jack stepped into the car, sat down, and began to talk. And his real name was not Jack, his name was Freddie Scappaticci. I remember when I read this detail, I remember just being confused and blown away by it. What on earth was Scappaticci doing speaking to the Cook Report? That's the question I kept coming back to. Was this some kind of Machiavellian ploy by the Brits? Was there some Le Carré-esque twist that I just hadn't worked out? And the answer is that his handlers had no idea. He was doing this purely of his own volition. Something about seeing Rose Hegarty talking about the death of her son and McGuinness's role in it had created a reaction inside Scappaticci and made him feel that he had to come forward, that he had to talk to the Cook Report producers. And very early on in their conversation, it became clear that he wanted to place all the blame for Hegarty's murder on one man, and that was Martin McGuinness. And can anyone see Freddie Scappaticci in this same picture? Yeah. Scappaticci and McGuinness were at times close, but by 1993, they'd completely fallen out. And Scappaticci, during this conversation, was at pains to say that McGuinness was the instrument of Hegarty's death. The producers then asked him, as they could tell from this word instrument, they weren't really sure about it, but they said, who actually killed Frank Hegarty? And Scappaticci said that it was someone other than McGuinness. The producers asked him how he knew that, and Scappaticci said nothing. They then asked Scappaticci if he was still part of the IRA, to which he said, no, there are more things in life than killing. Then they asked Scappaticci if he had ever killed someone himself, but he said nothing. But instead, he circled back straight away to Frank Hegarty's murder, and he began to tell the story this time in more detail. And this is what he said. He described how Frank Hegarty was told that he needed to meet 3 IRA men over the border. So he knew he was going for a meeting. That, by the way, would explain the smart clothes that he was wearing. Scappaticci said that Hegarty was interrogated by these 3 men, that one of the men was McGuinness, and that after Hegarty was taken away, the 3 men agreed that Hegarty had to be killed. But they didn't want Hegarty to be told this. Scappaticci then said that one of his friends was told to be one of the ones to go and kill Hegarty. but he wouldn't name who this friend was. So one of Scappaticci's friends took Heggerty away and told him that he was going home, when in fact he was being taken to his death. This would explain two things. It would explain the rope around the wrists being tied at first, but then being cut after Heggerty was told he was going home. And it would also explain, or begin to explain, part of the reason why there was a blindfold or masking tape over the eyes, so he couldn't see that in fact he was being taken somewhere other than to his home. Scappaticci continued with the story, and he got to the point where Heggerty was killed. And at this point in his story, he mentioned, almost as a throwaway remark, how many shots were fired in the night. And what's interesting is that in all of the newspaper reports and the police reports at the time, they were all consistent on one thing, and it was that there was just one shot fired that night. They all said it was one single shot to the back of the head. Many years after the Cook report, the post-mortem was released, and it emerged that in fact, there had been 4 shots, because there were 3 bullets that were left in the body that was taken away to the mortuary. Freddie Scappaticci referred to how many shots were fired that night. If he said there was just one shot, there's a very good chance that it really was a friend of his who killed Frank Heggerty, and that he was just going on what he had heard in the media. But if he said there were 4 shots, there's a very good chance that he heard them himself and that he was there that night, that he may have been the one to have killed Frank Heggerty. Now, you're going to hate me for this, but I'm going to leave the detail of how many shots he referred to for the book. Thank you so much for listening.
That was Henry Hemming, Sunday Times best-selling author of a variety of books, talking about his most recent one, 4 Shots in the Night. We hope you enjoyed it. And again, a reminder that if you'd like to hear more about the festival and other recordings of past contributors, please go to our website at www.westcorkhistoryfestival.org.